The letter came on a quiet March morning, carried by a dusty mail rider who barely slowed his horse as he tossed the envelope into the tin box nailed beside the ranch gate. Jackson Cole wasn't expecting anything important. Since losing his wife Lily to a fever 3 months earlier, his world had shrunk into a dull routine of feeding his last few cattle, patching fences, and trying to outrun the hollow ache inside him. Most days, he barely checked the mail at all. But this envelope was different. It was thick, official-looking, and carried the seal of a law office in Cheyenne, a place Jackson had never visited. He stood on the porch of his small cabin, the Wyoming wind tugging at his coat, and opened the envelope with hands rough from winter work. The letter inside made his breath catch. "We regret to inform you of the passing of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, and are writing to notify you that you have been named as sole beneficiary in her last will and testament." Jackson frowned, reading the line again as if his tired eyes were fooling him. Eleanor Whitfield. The name meant nothing. He read the whole page twice, maybe 3 times, searching for a clue. The letter explained that she had owned a large property in the central hills of Wyoming called the 7 Pines Ranch. 2,000 acres, untouched for years, and somehow she had left it all to him, a widowed rancher barely holding on to his own land. But the strangest part wasn't the land. It was the reason. Eleanor, whoever she was, had written in her will that Jackson was the son of her dear friend Maria Cole, who had once shown her kindness when kindness was rare. Jackson felt the wind push cold into his chest. His mother, Maria, had died when he was 17. She had worked as a cook for traveling cattle outfits and wealthy families around the territory, but she had never once mentioned a woman named Eleanor Whitfield. And she'd certainly never said anything about a ranch waiting for him somewhere out in the hills. The letter requested he travel to Cheyenne to meet the attorney and visit the ranch. Jackson folded the paper and stared at the empty pasture behind his cabin. Lily's horse stood alone near the fence line, lifting its head as if waiting for her to walk out the door the way she used to. The sight hit him hard. He needed something, anything, to pull him forward again. 3 days later, Jackson rode into Cheyenne and met the attorney, a gray-haired man named Noah Reed. Reed filled in the missing pieces. Jackson's mother had cared for Eleanor during the hardest years of her life, back when her husband was sick and her family was falling apart. Eleanor had never forgotten that kindness. "And now she left me her ranch?" Jackson asked quietly. Reed nodded. "She wanted it in the hands of someone who knew loss. Someone who wouldn't give up on a place that meant so much to her." "What kind of ranch was it?" Quote. Reed hesitated. "Cattle, once, but Miss Whitfield kept mostly to herself. I haven't seen the property in years. She insisted no one visit unless necessary." Later that afternoon, Jackson saddled a rental horse Reed had arranged and headed towards 7 Pines Ranch. The land grew wilder the farther he traveled. Tall grasses waved like ocean tides, and rocky ridges cut the sky in sharp angles. It was country that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. As he neared the ranch boundaries, Jackson noticed something strange. The fences were in perfect condition, tight wire, evenly spaced posts. Someone had been maintaining them. But who? The ranch house appeared over a rise, a weathered 2-story structure with a wide porch and shuttered windows. A big barn stood nearby, and a few smaller sheds dotted the hillside. Everything looked deserted, yet cared for, as if someone had walked away only yesterday. Jackson dismounted, tied the horse to a post, and stepped onto the porch. Silence wrapped around him, deep, steady, almost too heavy to breathe in. Then he heard it. A soft, distant sound carried by the wind, a sharp, echoing whinny. Then another. Jackson froze. Horses. More than one. And they weren't close. He walked past the barn, boots crunching on dry dirt, following the sound, until he reached a narrow trail that climbed toward a ridge behind the house. He climbed slowly, each step tightening the strange feeling in his chest. When he reached the top, he stopped dead in his tracks. Below him sprawled a wide, hidden valley he hadn't seen from the road. A valley alive with movement. Horses. Dozens of them. No. Far more than dozens. They moved in herds across the open stretch, like ripples of color. Bays, chestnuts, paints, duns, blacks, grays. Powerful stallions guarded their bands. Mares grazed in calm circles. Young colts kicked up dust as they raced one another through the tall grass. Jackson's breath left him in one long, disbelieving exhale. These weren't ranch horses. They were wild Mustangs, a massive, thriving, untouched herd living on the land he had just inherited. He counted until he lost track. 70. 90. 100. More in the distance. Maybe even 200. "What in God's name?" Jackson whispered. No one in town had said a word about wild Mustangs living out here. Why had Eleanor kept them a secret? How long had they been here? And why leave them for him? As he stood on that ridge, watching the Mustangs move like a living river across the valley, Jackson felt something shift inside him, something he thought had died the night Lily took her last breath. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of purpose, but he also felt a cold truth settle heavily on his shoulders. If these horses were his now, then so was whatever responsibility Eleanor had carried alone for years. Jackson stood on that ridge for a long time, unable to move as the wind pushed against his coat and the Mustangs flowed across the land like a river with a heartbeat. Everything he thought he knew about the ranch, about the woman who had owned it, about his own future, shifted in that single moment. The herd was far larger than anything he had ever seen. Wild horses weren't meant to be this many in one place, not in these hills, not without someone watching over them. He made his way down the ridge, moving slow enough not to spook the nearest bands. The horses lifted their heads when he got close, but instead of bolting, they simply studied him with calm, alert eyes. Their coats were thick from winter, their bodies strong, their movements smooth and steady. These weren't starving, struggling wild horses. They were healthy, well-fed, safe. That raised even more questions. Jackson found clear signs of human work. Springs cleared of debris. Natural pools deepened and reinforced with rocks. Paths worn not just by hooves, but by wagon wheels, or maybe supply carts. Someone had been taking care of these Mustangs for years. Quietly. Carefully. Without the world knowing. Back at the ranch house, Jackson searched for answers. The key fit the door easily. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Everything inside was neat, tidy, and lived in. Just not recently. In the front room, photographs filled every wall. Wild horses running, stallions fighting, mares nursing foals. Entire herds sweeping across open range. Some photos were faded. Others were clearly recent. Eleanor Whitfield had spent decades studying these animals. Jackson walked into a small room that must have been her study. Dust lay on the surface of a large wooden desk, but the drawers opened smoothly. Inside were folders stacked neatly, each labeled by year. When he pulled one open, he found detailed records, names of horses Eleanor had identified, maps of their grazing patterns, notes on injuries, births, and weather changes. Everything was dated, organized, and written in a steady hand that looked firm even into her old age. One folder, marked Important, held a letter addressed to my heir. Jackson sat down in Eleanor's worn leather chair and unfolded the paper. If you are reading this, then my time has ended, and the herd now depends on you. You have seen them by now. You understand why they cannot fall into the wrong hands. These Mustangs are not ordinary wild horses. Many were rescued decades ago when the government planned to thin herds across the region. Others were taken in during drought years when they would have starved. The rest are descendants born under the open sky of Seven Pines. They know freedom here, but they also know safety, because I gave them both. Jackson swallowed hard, reading every word slowly. I chose you because your mother gave me kindness when I was drowning in grief. I never forgot her, and when I learned of your losses, I hoped that perhaps this ranch might offer you what it offered me, a reason to keep living. Do not be afraid. You will not learn everything at once. I didn't either. Trust the horses. They will teach you. Jackson lowered the letter and rubbed the back of his neck. The room felt too quiet, as if holding its breath. The next morning, he he saddled the rental horse and rode out to explore. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of morning where every sound traveled far. As he rode deeper into the valley, the Mustangs watched him but didn't scatter. A few youngsters trotted closer, curious. A big paint stallion stepped in front of them, snorting a warning that sent the colts back to their mothers. "You're the boss around here, huh?" Jackson murmured softly. The stallion stood tall, muscles thick beneath his winter coat, mane blowing like a banner. Jackson felt something settle in his chest, a strange mix of respect, fear, and connection. By noon, he knew this land wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. The Mustangs had carved trails into the hillsides, worn drinking spots near the springs, and shaped the valley into a hidden world most folks would never believe existed. But he also realized something unsettling. This operation, if it could even be called that, was far too big for one person. When he returned to the barn, he noticed fresh tracks near the door. Boot tracks. He followed them around the corner and nearly ran straight into a woman unloading hay from a wagon. She looked to be in her early 50s, with wind-brown skin, sharp eyes, and a steady way of moving. "You must be Jackson Cole," she said without hesitation. "I'm Drive Ruth Harding. I handled vet work here for Miss Whitfield." Jackson blinked. Did she tell you I was coming?" "No," Ruth said simply. "But when she passed, I figured someone would show up eventually, and those horses don't stop needing care just because she's gone." She tossed another bale to the ground. Jackson hurried to help, but she waved him off. "You're new. You watch first." Ruth explained everything while she worked. How Eleanor had moved injured Mustangs here in small groups, how she monitored births, how she prevented overgrazing by rotating herds from one valley to another. Ruth had been coming twice a month for years. "But she kept everything secret," Jackson said. Ruth nodded. "Because folks wouldn't understand. Some would try to take the horses. Others would call it foolishness. But she believed in what she was doing. I did too." Jackson hesitated before speaking the question that had been sitting under his ribs since he arrived. "Do you think I can do this?" Quote. Ruth studied him for a long moment. Jackson stood still, the cold wind pushing against his back while the Mustangs grazed unseen beyond the ridge. Finally, she said, "That depends. Are you willing to learn? To give everything you've got? Because these horses don't need a perfect man. They just need someone who won't quit." Jackson let out a slow breath. "I'm not sure what I am yet." "Good," Ruth said with a small smile. "That means you're not running away." "Not yet." That night, Jackson lay in the guest room staring at the wooden ceiling while the soft sounds of horses drifted through the dark. He didn't know if he was ready. He didn't know if he was strong enough. But when morning came, he found himself on the ridge again, watching the Mustangs move like shadows through the rising sun. Something in him reached toward them. And for the first time in a long while, he felt himself reaching back. Jackson woke before sunrise on his 10th day at Seven Pines Ranch. The sky was still dark. A deep blue stretched tight over the hills, and the air had that sharp edge that hinted at late winter storms. He stepped onto the porch with a cup of hot coffee and listened. He had begun to recognize the valley's sounds now. The low rumble of distant hooves, the soft calls between mares and their young, the occasional sharp cry of a stallion claiming his place in the herd. Those sounds no longer felt strange. They felt like company. But that morning, something in the valley was wrong. A high, urgent call cut through the air. A sound sharper than he had heard before. Jackson set his cup down, grabbed his coat, and hurried toward the ridge. By the time he reached the top, the sun had just begun to crawl over the hills, casting pale light across the valley. Then he saw it. A young mare struggling near the creek bed, her legs trembling as she kicked at the ground. A newborn foal lay beside her, still slick, barely moving. The mare tried to stand over her baby, tried to shield it, but she was weak, too weak. Jackson's heart hammered. He didn't know everything about foaling, but he knew trouble when he saw it. He ran back toward the barn as fast as his boots could carry him, saddled his horse with shaking hands, and rode down into the valley. When he reached the mare, he slid from the saddle and knelt beside her. The foal was breathing, but barely. The mare nudged it weakly, then swayed and stumbled. "Easy, girl," Jackson said softly. "You're not alone, not anymore." He remembered Eleanor's letter. "Trust the horses, they will teach you." But right now, the mare needed more than trust. She needed help. Jackson stroked her neck, speaking in a calm voice until her trembling slowed. He'd spent enough time with cattle over the years to recognize that she was dehydrated and exhausted. He needed to get water to her and warmth to the foal. Alone, it would take too long, so he did the one thing he had been unsure he had the right to do. He whistled loudly, sharply, the way he used to when calling cattle dogs back home. The sound echoed off the hills. Minutes later, he heard hoofbeats approaching from above. Dr. Ruth Harding rode hard down the slope, her horse kicking up dust in long streaks. She must have heard the whistle from her wagon trail near the highway. She dismounted before her horse even stopped moving. "Show me," quote. Jackson stepped aside. Ruth knelt beside the mare, checked her quickly, then looked up at him with urgency. "She's losing strength. If she goes down completely, both she and the foal will die." "What do we do?" Jackson asked. "We don't panic," she said firmly. "And we work together." What followed was a blur. Jackson hauling warm blankets from Ruth's saddlebags, Ruth guiding him through the steps of clearing the foal's airways, then helping the newborn stand for the first time while the mare struggled to keep her footing. The wind cut hard across the valley, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. At one point, as Jackson held the foal against his chest for warmth, the mare nudged him gently, her eyes soft and full of something he had never felt from an animal before. Trust. Ruth noticed it too. "She knows you're here for her," she whispered. "That counts more than you think." After an hour of careful work, the foal finally nursed. The mare trembled with exhaustion, but stood steady enough to keep her baby safe. The danger had passed. Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Jackson. Better than good." He looked at the mare and her newborn, alive because he hadn't turned away. "I didn't think I could do this," he said quietly. "I didn't think I was strong enough." Ruth shook her head. "Strength doesn't come first. Purpose does. Eleanor knew that. She chose you because she saw a man who wouldn't give up." Jackson stared out at the valley, the morning sun now breaking free of the clouds. The Mustangs looked golden in the new light, moving with a grace that seemed older than anything he had ever known. "Ruth," he said softly, "I think I know what I'm supposed to do." She smiled. "I figured you'd get there." Spring turned to summer, and Jackson was no longer the lost widower who had arrived with nothing but questions. He rose before dawn, checking water sources and grazing paths. He learned each herd by the way it moved, learned the stallions by their calls, learned the mothers by the way they guarded their young. He discovered that the Mustangs had a rhythm older than ranching, older than fences, older than men, and slowly, that rhythm began to stitch something inside him back together. He repaired old gates, strengthened water lines, built new shade structures in narrow canyons. Ruth visited often, teaching him everything Eleanor had taught her. They worked side by side until the horses no longer watched him with caution, but with something close to recognition. By early fall, Jackson stood on the ridge again, just as he had on the first day. But everything was different now. The paint stallion, the same proud leader he'd seen that first afternoon, approached with slow, confident steps. The herd parted around him like water around a stone. He stopped just a few yards from Jackson and gave a low, steady rumble that felt less like a warning and more like an acknowledgement. Jackson lifted his hat slightly in return. "Don't worry," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." The wind swept across the valley, carrying the sound of the herd like a living tide. Jackson felt the weight of grief inside him ease. Not gone, but no longer swallowing him whole. Lily had been his heart. But this place, these Mustangs, had become his purpose. He finally understood what Eleanor Whitfield had hoped he would find. Not just a ranch, not just a herd, but a reason to keep living. And as the stallion turned and rejoined his herd, Jackson closed his eyes and let the sound of their hooves wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New births, new trials, new beginnings. But tonight, Jackson Cole stood tall on the ridge of Seven Pines Ranch. And for the first time since losing Lily, he felt whole.